Henry Kissinger is certainly the most famous, probably the most controversial, and possibly the most influential Secretary of State in recent American history. He brought President Nixon to Beijing, opening up relations with what most people then called Red China. The Nobel Prize winner talked with America's adversaries overseas, even while he made some enemies at home over the war in Vietnam. Kissinger engineered détente, and that took a lot of the frost out of the Cold War with the Soviet Union. Henry Kissinger joins me now in the global public square. Henry, you've watched administrations in high points and low points. You worked for a president who went through some very rough times. What do you think is the most important skill that a president is going to need in 2009? What could throw them off course? What do they have to what advice would you give, no matter whether it is Senator McCain or Senator Obama who were elected? What would you tell them in January if you were called to the Oval Office?
They should ask themselves what kind of a world they want in detail at the end of 4 years, not in slogans or in general objectives, but what is it that they can hope for? Because the art of statesmanship is to find a position between stagnation and overextension, hopefully at the outer limit of what is possible. But it cannot be done if you let yourself be driven by a series of tactical decisions without some perception of what you're trying to bring about.
I know that you're going next week to Moscow. You're going to see President Putin or Prime Minister Putin and the new president. You see American interests as more aligned with Russia's than a lot of people. You think that fundamentally the United States and Russia could have a significantly greater strategic cooperation than they do now?
No, I think Russia has gone through a tremendous upheaval in the last 20 years. It has lost 300 years of its history. I believe that Russia and we have a number of common interests. Between us, we have 95% of the world's nuclear stockpiles. So if the nuclear issue is going to be brought under some negotiated control, Russia must be a part of it. Thirdly, Russia has a long frontier with Islam and a long frontier with Iran. So they have to be an integral component of any negotiation with Iran, or at least of any settlement of the nuclear issue. And when I look at the Russian frontiers, they have a long frontier with China, which is a big demographic problem for them because there are 30 million Russians on one side, 1 billion Chinese on the other. They have a long frontier with Islam, which is an ideological nightmare for them because you have the jihadist trend and 25 million population of Russia is Muslim and it's living along the border. And they have a frontier with Europe with which they're historically uncomfortable for the reasons I gave. Now that is the one that creates tensions and in which our views are not identical. But I believe that with some patience and some understanding on both sides, that Russia should be a component of the international system. And I do not think we should apply to Russia the principles of the Cold War unless they absolutely provoke us, which they haven't done.
So you are not in favor of kicking Russia out of the G8?
You're determined to get me into trouble with an old friend. But I disagree with Senator McCain on that point.
And if you were to expand the G8, you would include China?
I would include China, India, and probably Brazil. And I think it should be expanded.
But in a broader sense, what you're talking about is drawing these emerging powers into the global framework, rather than trying to create new lines.
They are part of the global framework as a result of globalization. Many of the global problems, there are many problems in the world today, climate, environment, even the supply of energy, that can only be dealt with on a global basis. And I don't think it is wise to isolate certain countries on the basis of political ideology unless they challenge fundamental American national interests.
Let's talk about probably the most immediate and pressing challenge that a new president would have, which is Iraq. About a year ago, you gave an interview in which you said military victory of the traditional, by the traditional definition, is probably not attainable in Iraq, by which you meant a complete control over all parts of Iraq, a complete cessation of sectarian violence and such. And I think it's fair to say that even with the success of the surge, those conditions have not been met. So are we at a point where we can start thinking strategically about what we want to do in Iraq?
I think the conditions are approaching. They may already begin to exist now, in which there exists a foreign ministers' conference of all neighboring states that Iran and Syria have also joined, plus Egypt, plus the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. That could be activated at the right moment, or given a greater impetus. And my view is that this is the goal a new administration should work for. That will probably occur side by side, almost certainly occur side by side, with a reduction of American forces. But if you make the reduction of American forces the principal component of that policy, and if you announce a deadline for it at the beginning of the process, then you remove the incentives of several of the players, but particularly of Iran and to a lesser extent Syria, to participate in this process in a positive manner. And my view is that it has to be dealt with as a general Middle East problem, because...
Including talking to Syria?
Yes, I'm in favor of... look, I don't consider... well, first of all, let me say, I do not agree that talking with the heads of government is the right way to start these negotiations. So I believe in negotiations that are carefully prepared, based on a strategic assessment, and that you are willing to face the consequences of failure rather than turning negotiations into a psychiatric exercise in which you are trying to ease the mind of your adversary. You have to assume your adversary